The village hall at St. Mary Mead possessed that particular charm found only in buildings that have witnessed decades of human ceremony. Tonight, its utilitarian bones had been transformed by careful hands and borrowed elegance into something approaching grandeur. Streamers of dried hops hung from the ancient beams like punctuation marks declaring harvest joy, while jam jars wrapped in twine cradled small chrysanthemums at each place setting. The scent of furniture polish mingled with the heady optimism that accompanies any gathering where the entire village has been invited to witness prosperity in action. Mrs. Eugenia Cavendish, chairwoman of the Harvest Festival Committee and self-appointed guardian of what constituted proper village society, surveyed the long tables with the satisfaction of a general reviewing well-ordered troops. She had dressed for the occasion in navy silk, the better to display a diamond brooch that had belonged to her late mother and possessed the mysterious property of catching light even in the dimmest corners. Every napkin lay properly folded. Every place card bore her careful script, and the salt cellars gleamed with fresh polish. "It will do beautifully," she murmured to herself, though what she truly meant was, "It will impress him." Near the far end of one table, Miss Jane Marple had taken her customary unobtrusive seat, arriving early as was her habit when social gatherings promised to be illuminating. She wore her best dove-gray dress and a small hat with a velvet band, her bright blue eyes taking in the careful preparations with the gentle interest of someone who understood that human nature revealed itself most clearly in moments of intended celebration. Her cottage on the village green was but a short walk away, yet she had come prepared for a long evening, carrying with her the sort of patient attention that had served her well through decades of observing her fellow creatures. The rum baba she had contributed to the evening's dessert course now rested safely in the kitchen, and Miss Marple arranged her gloves with quiet satisfaction. She had positioned herself with a clear view of the entire assembly, noting with approval how Mrs. Cavendish had managed the seating arrangements. The vicar opposite the doctor, to balance enthusiasm with reflection. The postmistress strategically distant from the butcher, whose recent dismissal of her nephew still rankled. And most tellingly, their guest of honor placed where every eye would naturally fall upon him throughout the evening. When Rupert Ashworth entered the hall, he brought with him the sort of presence that seemed to expand the very air around him. Recently returned to St. Mary Mead after 20 years in London's financial districts, he had purchased the old manor house and announced his intention to restore it to its proper glory. He was not, strictly speaking, a handsome man. His features were too sharp, his smile too practiced, but he possessed that quality which made people lean forward when he spoke and remember his words long after he had left the room. His wife Lydia followed 2 steps behind, a woman perhaps 15 years his junior, whose beauty had the fragile quality of something carefully preserved. She wore an emerald dress that complemented her dark hair, and a wedding ring that caught the light as she nervously adjusted her gloves. Miss Marple noted how Lydia's eyes swept the room not with curiosity, but with something approaching wariness, as if she were calculating distances to the nearest exit. The evening progressed through its carefully orchestrated movements. Cold salmon with dill appeared and disappeared with appropriate murmurs of appreciation. Wine flowed in measured portions, loosening tongues just enough to make conversation sparkle without becoming indiscreet. Mr. Ashworth held court from his position of honor, regaling the assembly with tales of London society and his plans for modernizing certain village traditions that had, in his opinion, grown rather quaint. Miss Marple listened with the sort of attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern, noting not just the words, but the spaces between them. She observed how Dr. Haydock's responses grew increasingly terse as the evening progressed, how young Tom Penbury, the schoolmaster, watched Lydia Ashworth with the sort of hopeless devotion that belongs exclusively to poetry and tragedy, and how Mrs. Cavendish's smile had acquired a brittle quality whenever her guest of honor offered suggestions for improving village life. It was during the main course, a splendid game pie with pastry like fine architecture, that Miss Marple first noticed the subtle shift in the evening's rhythm. Ashworth had been describing his success with a recent property development when he paused mid-sentence, his hand moving to his throat with an almost unconscious gesture. The pause lasted only a moment before he resumed speaking, but Miss Marple had caught the flicker of something, discomfort, confusion, that crossed his features. "Are you quite well, Mr. Ashworth?" inquired Dr. Haydock, his professional instincts alert to any sign of distress. "Perfectly fine," Ashworth replied, though his voice carried a slight hoarseness. "Perhaps the wine is a bit stronger than I'm accustomed to." He reached for his water glass, and Miss Marple noticed how his hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he lifted it to his lips. Lydia Ashworth had gone very still, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, watching her husband with an expression that might have been concern or might have been something else entirely. Beside her, Tom Penbury leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to offer assistance, while Mrs. Cavendish's eyes darted between her guest of honor and the kitchen door, calculating whether intervention was required. The transformation, when it came, was swift and terrible. One moment, Ashworth was reaching for his wine glass, preparing to offer what he had announced would be a toast to new beginnings in our beloved village. The next, his face had drained of all color, his breathing becoming labored and erratic. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against his plate and sending wine spreading across the white tablecloth like spilled blood. "Rupert!" Lydia's cry pierced the sudden silence as her husband doubled over, clutching his chest. Dr. Haydock was beside him instantly, professional training overriding social protocol, but even as he reached for a pulse, Ashworth's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed forward onto the table, scattering china and crystal in his fall. The elegant dinner had become a scene of chaos. Mrs. Cavendish stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth in horror. The vicar began a prayer that died on his lips as Dr. Haydock straightened, his face grim with certainty. "He's gone," the doctor announced quietly. "Mr. Ashworth is dead." In the stunned silence that followed, Miss Marple remained seated, her teacup still balanced in her steady hands. While others exclaimed and questioned and demanded explanations, she found herself studying the scene with the sort of careful attention she might give to a garden where something had grown unexpectedly wrong. Her gaze took in the overturned wine glass, the scattered fragments of china, and most particularly the faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds that seemed to linger in the air despite the competing aromas of spilled wine and rich food. She noticed, too, how quickly Lydia Ashworth's shock had given way to a peculiar stillness, how Tom Penbury's hand had instinctively moved to steady her chair, and how Mrs. Cavendish, for all her distress, had already begun calculating the social implications of having a guest die at her carefully planned dinner party. But what struck Miss Marple most forcefully was a small detail that others, in their shock and confusion, had overlooked entirely. Beside Ashworth's place-setting, nearly hidden beneath his fallen napkin, lay a second wine glass, one that had not been there when the evening began and which now bore the faintest trace of something that was decidedly not wine. The perfect dinner party had ended in the most imperfect way imaginable, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting that in her considerable experience, when someone died so dramatically in such a public setting, it was rarely as simple as it appeared. The evening's careful choreography had been disrupted by something far more sinister than indigestion, and she suspected that before this particular mystery reached its conclusion, more than one carefully guarded secret would be dragged into the unforgiving light of the truth. As Constable Polk was summoned and the guests were asked to remain seated, Miss Marple quietly adjusted her gloves and prepared to do what she had always done best: watch, listen, and remember that human nature, for all its infinite variety, followed patterns as predictable as the changing seasons. The stunned silence that followed Dr. Haydock's pronouncement stretched across the village hall like a held breath broken only by the gentle tick of the ancient clock and Mrs. Cavendish's barely audible whimper. The elegant dinner party had transformed into something altogether more sinister, and the carefully arranged tables now seemed to frame a scene from a particularly unsettling theatrical production. Miss Marple remained seated, her teacup still balanced in steady hands, observing how shock affected each person differently. Mrs. Cavendish had pressed both hands to her mouth, her diamond brooch catching the light as she trembled, while the vicar's wife dabbed at tears that seemed born more from the disruption of propriety than genuine grief. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat repeatedly, as if preparing to take charge, though his military bearing had deserted him entirely in the face of civilian catastrophe. It was Lydia Ashworth's reaction that drew Miss Marple's particular attention. The young widow sat with remarkable composure, her hands folded in her lap, watching her husband's still form with an expression that might have been shock, or might have been something else entirely. When Tom Penbury leaned toward her with obvious concern, offering quiet words of comfort, she acknowledged him with the smallest nod but did not speak. There was something in her stillness that reminded Miss Marple of a cat she had once observed, sitting perfectly motionless while waiting for a mouse to reveal itself. The heavy footsteps of Constable Polk echoed through the hall as he arrived, slightly out of breath and clearly overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. Polk was a decent man who dealt admirably with bicycle theft and the occasional poaching incident, but sudden death at a village dinner party exceeded his usual purview entirely. Right then, Polk began, consulting his notebook with exaggerated authority, nobody's to leave, and nothing's to be touched until proper investigation can be conducted. Dr. Haydock, what's your assessment? The doctor straightened, wiping his hands carefully on his napkin. Appears to be cardiac arrest, though I'll need to examine him more thoroughly. The onset was remarkably sudden for a man of his apparent health. He paused, his gaze moving briefly to Miss Marple before continuing. There are certain symptoms that warrant further investigation. Miss Marple caught the subtle emphasis in his words and nodded almost imperceptibly. The faint scent of bitter almonds that had caught her attention earlier told its own story to those who knew how to read such signs. She allowed her gaze to drift once more to the area around Ashworth's place setting, noting details that others, in their shock and confusion, had overlooked entirely. The mysterious second wine glass remained beside his fallen napkin, though she observed it had shifted slightly during the commotion. More intriguingly, a place card lay partially displaced beneath a scattered plate, its careful script now smeared as if touched by a damp finger. The blue-black ink had blurred, but she could still make out Tom Penn before the rest disappeared beneath china fragments. "We must telephone Inspector Craddock immediately," declared Colonel Bantry, finally finding his voice. "This requires proper investigation." His wife murmured agreement while continuing to dab at her eyes, though Miss Marple noticed her tears had dried remarkably quickly for someone witnessing sudden death. As Polk made arrangements for the inspector's arrival, Miss Marple rose with the careful deliberation of age and offered to inform the kitchen staff that no further service would be required. Polk hesitated, then nodded gratefully, recognizing that Miss Marple's presence tended to smooth rather than ruffle feathers in moments of crisis. The kitchen retained the warmth and rich aromas of the evening's preparation, though the atmosphere had grown heavy with whispered speculation. On the sideboard, her rum baba sat untouched alongside 2 opened bottles of claret. Miss Marple noted with interest that while one bottle bore a properly inserted cork, the other had been recorked unevenly, as if done hastily or by nervous hands. When she returned to the hall, the atmosphere had settled into that peculiar quiet that follows unexpected drama. Theories had begun to circulate in hushed tones. Heart failure brought on by rich food, the strain of modern life, the shock of returning to village ways after London's pace. Dr. Haydock neither confirmed nor contradicted these suggestions, which in itself spoke volumes to those who knew him well. Miss Marple resumed her seat and adjusted her gloves, preparing for what she suspected would be a long evening. In her considerable experience, when someone died so dramatically in such a public setting, surrounded by people who each harbored their own secrets and resentments, the truth rarely emerged easily. The carefully choreographed dinner had become something far more complex, and she settled back with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most revealing moments often came not in dramatic pronouncements, but in the quiet spaces between words where human nature revealed its true face. The evening's mystery had only just begun. Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived with the sort of quiet efficiency that immediately transformed the atmosphere from shocked confusion to purposeful investigation. Miss Marple observed with approval how his presence seemed to settle the gathering, not through dramatic pronouncements, but through the simple authority of someone accustomed to finding truth in the midst of human deception. He removed his hat, surveyed the scene with practiced eyes, and began the delicate work of transforming a dinner party into a crime scene. His first consultation with Dr. Haydock was conducted in voices too low for general hearing, but Miss Marple noted how both men's expressions grew increasingly grave as they spoke. The doctor's earlier mention of bitter almonds had clearly registered with the inspector, and when Craddock moved to examine the table more closely, his attention focused immediately on the area around Ashworth's place setting. "I shall need statements from everyone present," Craddock announced, his voice carrying the sort of calm authority that discouraged argument. "Until then, I must ask for your patience and cooperation. Nothing on these tables is to be disturbed, and I would prefer that conversation be kept to essential matters only." Mrs. Cavendish was among the first to be questioned, and her account tumbled forth in a mixture of genuine distress and careful self-preservation. She detailed the evening's preparations with meticulous precision, emphasizing her own careful planning and the impossibility that anything could have gone wrong through her negligence. Miss Marple listened with particular interest as Mrs. Cavendish described the seating arrangements, noting how the hostess seemed to recall every detail except those that might prove inconvenient. "The place cards were arranged this afternoon," Mrs. Cavendish insisted, her voice carrying the authority of someone defending her domestic competence. "Everyone was seated exactly as intended. Mr. Ashworth at the head table, naturally with Mrs. Ashworth beside him. Tom Penbury was placed 3 seats down, where the younger people usually sit. I would never misplace a card." It was then that Constable Polk, following Craddock's careful instructions, discovered the anomaly that would prove so significant. Lifting a fallen plate with exaggerated care, he revealed a place card lying beneath, its elegant script blurred by what appeared to be moisture. The visible portion read, "Tom Penn," before dissolving into illegible smears as if someone had touched it with damp fingers. Miss Marple watched the discovery with the sort of quiet attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. The card's position, so close to Ashworth's place setting yet clearly displaced from where Tom Penbury actually sat, suggested movement that had not been part of the evening's original choreography. More intriguingly, she observed how young Penbury himself reacted to the discovery, his face flushing with what might have been embarrassment or might have been something else entirely. When Craddock questioned Lydia Ashworth, Miss Marple was struck by the young widow's remarkable composure. Where others showed obvious distress or nervous energy, Lydia maintained a stillness that seemed almost studied in its perfection. Her answers came readily, but without the sort of elaboration that genuine shock typically produced. "Rupert was in excellent health," Lydia stated quietly, her hands folded with careful precision in her lap. "Dr. Morrison in London examined him thoroughly just 3 months ago. There were no heart problems, no concerning symptoms of any kind." Her voice carried the sort of measured control that suggested either remarkable strength of character or considerable practice in managing difficult situations. Tom Penbury's questioning proved more revealing, though perhaps not in ways the young schoolmaster intended. His obvious concern for Lydia's well-being, His nervous glances in her direction and his stammered explanations of his seating arrangements painted a picture of devotion that extended well beyond mere neighborly sympathy. Miss Marple noted how his hands trembled slightly as he explained his position at the far end of the table, and how his eyes kept returning to the mysterious place card as if it were a mathematical problem he couldn't quite solve. Throughout these preliminary interviews, Miss Marple maintained her position as an apparently passive observer, but her mind was busy cataloguing details that others might overlook. The second wine glass beside Ashworth's place setting had now been properly identified and secured, but she remembered her earlier observation of the hastily recorked bottle in the kitchen. The evening's wine service had followed a specific pattern, yet someone had clearly accessed additional wine after the formal service had concluded. Dr. Haydock's professional assessment, delivered quietly to Inspector Craddock, confirmed what the more observant guests had already suspected. The symptoms Ashworth had displayed, combined with the distinctive scent that lingered despite the competing aromas of spilled wine and rich food, pointed toward something far more sinister than simple heart failure. The doctor's grave expression as he spoke with the inspector left little doubt that they were dealing with deliberate poisoning rather than natural causes. As the evening wore on and the initial shock began to settle into grim reality, Miss Marple found herself studying the subtle dynamics between the various personalities involved. Mrs. Cavendish's careful answers suggested someone calculating potential damage to her social position. Tom Penbury's obvious distress seemed genuine, but was complicated by his equally obvious feelings for the victim's widow. Most intriguingly, Lydia Ashworth's controlled responses and measured reactions suggested either remarkable inner strength or the sort of careful preparation that came from anticipating exactly such questions. The physical evidence was beginning to tell its own story to those who knew how to read such signs. The displaced place card, the mysterious second wine glass, the hastily recorked bottle, and the victim's sudden onset of symptoms all pointed toward careful planning rather than spontaneous action. Miss Marple reflected that in her considerable experience with human nature, when someone died so dramatically in such a public setting, the perpetrator was almost invariably someone who had been present to observe the results of their handiwork. As Inspector Craddock concluded his preliminary questioning and began making arrangements for more detailed statements the following day, Miss Marple gathered her gloves and prepared for the short walk home. The evening's carefully orchestrated dinner had revealed far more about the guests than anyone had intended, and she suspected that before this particular mystery reached its resolution, several more carefully guarded secrets would need to be dragged into the unforgiving light of investigation. The village hall, so recently filled with the warmth of celebration, now held the chill of suspicion and unspoken accusations. The dinner that had never properly ended was transforming into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple social gathering, and Miss Marple found herself looking forward to the challenge of unraveling the human motivations that had turned an evening of village hospitality into a scene of calculated murder. The morning light that filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room carried with it the sort of crystalline clarity that often follows dramatic events, as if the very air had been purged of comfortable illusions. She had risen early, as was her custom, but found her usual morning routine disrupted by an unusual restlessness that drew her repeatedly to the window overlooking the village green. The familiar rhythms of St. Mary Mead had acquired a subtle discord, like a well-tuned piano with one key slightly flat. By 7:30, the village's informal communication network had activated with the efficiency of a military operation. Mrs. Price at the post office had positioned herself strategically behind her counter, ready to dispense information along with stamps and postal orders. The baker's wife lingered longer than necessary at her front gate, and even the usually taciturn Mr. Tither at the grocer's had developed an unprecedented interest in extended conversations with his customers. Miss Marple observed these developments with the sort of quiet appreciation she might give to a particularly well-orchestrated theatrical performance. Inspector Craddock's return to the village hall confirmed what the more observant residents had already suspected. The police surgeon's motor car, arriving shortly after dawn, had brought with it official confirmation of what Dr. Haydock's experience had suggested the previous evening. The bitter almond scent that had lingered despite the competing aromas of spilled wine and rich food told its own story to those who knew how to read such signs. Rupert Ashworth had been murdered, and the method was cyanide poisoning, administered with a precision that spoke of careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. It was during her morning marketing that Miss Marple encountered the first fruits of the village's investigative enthusiasm. Mrs. Price, her spectacles gleaming with the light of someone who possessed valuable information, leaned across her counter with a sort of confidential manner that guaranteed her words would be repeated within the hour. "Shocking business, Miss Marple," she began, though her tone suggested fascination rather than genuine horror. "That poor young Mr. Penbury was seen leaving the manor house not an hour ago, looking quite distressed. Slipped out through the side gate like someone who didn't want to be observed. Makes you wonder what business a schoolmaster might have with a newly widowed lady at such an early hour." Miss Marple accepted this intelligence with appropriate gravity, while privately noting how quickly village speculation had focused on the most emotionally charged explanation. Tom Penbury's obvious devotion to Lydia Ashworth had been an open secret, the sort of tender, hopeless attachment that provided endless material for romantic speculation. Now, in the harsh light of sudden death, it had transformed into something far more sinister in the collective village imagination. The morning's second significant development came in the form of Inspector Craddock himself, appearing at Miss Marple's garden gate with the sort of respectful determination that indicated a consultation rather than a social call. She welcomed him into her sitting room, noting how his usually composed demeanor carried traces of the frustration that accompanied cases where the obvious solution felt somehow incomplete. "I wondered if you might share your impressions of last evening," Craddock began, accepting the tea she offered with grateful efficiency. "Your observations often illuminate aspects that formal investigation might overlook." Miss Marple settled herself with the deliberate care of someone preparing for a lengthy discussion. "I found the evening quite revealing, though perhaps not in ways the participants intended. Young Mr. Penbury's distress was certainly evident, but distress and guilt, in my experience, are not always the same thing. The truly guilty often display remarkable composure, while the innocent frequently appear most suspicious." She described her observations of the previous evening with characteristic precision, noting Lydia Ashworth's almost studied calm, the mysterious second wineglass that had appeared beside her husband's place setting, and the hastily recorked bottle she had observed in the kitchen. Most significantly, she mentioned her impression that someone had acted under what she termed borrowed authority in managing the wine service. "People who are uncertain of their right to act," she explained gently, "often invoke someone else's name to justify their actions. It provides both permission and, if necessary, an excuse." Craddock's expression sharpened with interest. "We've confirmed that someone did indeed request additional wine during the evening. Mrs. Cavendish denies sending anyone for more bottles, yet young Alf Briggs insists she specifically instructed him to fetch another claret from the kitchen stores." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Penbury himself, appearing at Miss Marple's door with a sort of desperate urgency that suggested a conscience in considerable turmoil. His usual neat appearance had given way to the disheveled look of someone who had spent the night wrestling with moral dilemmas rather than sleeping peacefully. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice carrying the strain of someone who had reached the limits of his ability to bear secrets alone, "I must speak with Inspector Craddock. There are things about last evening that I should have mentioned earlier, but I was concerned about protecting someone who has already suffered enough." The story that emerged painted a picture of relationships far more complex than the previous evening's formal seating arrangements had suggested. Tom's confession revealed that his position near the head table had not been accidental, but had resulted from Lydia Ashworth's quiet request during the interval between courses. She had claimed to feel faint and had asked him to move closer, a request that had required switching place cards and had resulted in the mysterious displaced card bearing his partial name. She seemed genuinely distressed, Tom explained, his hands trembling slightly as he recounted the evening's events. I couldn't refuse to help her, though I realize now how suspicious the arrangement must appear. But I must emphasize that Mrs. Ashworth had no knowledge of my feelings for her beyond ordinary friendship. Any suggestion that we conspired together is absolutely false. Inspector Craddock listened with the sort of professional attention that revealed nothing of his thoughts, though Miss Marple noted how Tom's voluntary confession seemed to complicate rather than simplify the emerging picture. The young man's obvious sincerity was compelling, yet his admission provided both an explanation for the physical evidence and a clear motive for removing an inconvenient husband. The morning's revelations continued with the arrival of Mrs. Cavendish, bearing winter apples and wearing an expression that suggested concerns extending well beyond neighborly charity. Her conversation revealed additional details about the evening's preparations that cast the wine service in an entirely new light. Rupert Ashworth had specifically requested a particular vintage of claret, claiming sentimental significance as the wine served at his wedding to Lydia. The request had required considerable effort to fulfill, involving correspondence with London wine merchants and careful coordination to ensure proper delivery. He was most insistent about it, Mrs. Cavendish explained, her voice carrying traces of irritation at the memory. He said it would be a romantic gesture that would surprise and delight his wife. Though I must say, when he began his toast about new beginnings, Mrs. Ashworth looked more startled than pleased, almost as if she hadn't expected such sentiment from him. As her visitors departed and the morning settled into quieter rhythms, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the emerging pattern of relationships and motivations that surrounded the previous evening's tragedy. The police investigation was clearly focusing on Tom Penbury as the most obvious suspect, and the evidence certainly supported such a conclusion. His devotion to Lydia was undeniable, his presence near the victim had been established, and his nervous behavior provided the sort of emotional confirmation that investigators often found compelling. Yet Miss Marple's considerable experience with human nature suggested a more complex truth. The careful planning required for cyanide poisoning seemed inconsistent with the impulsive act of a man driven by overwhelming emotion. More puzzling was Lydia Ashworth's behavior throughout the crisis, her remarkable composure suggesting either exceptional strength of character or careful preparation for exactly such circumstances. The morning's investigations had provided new pieces to the puzzle, but Miss Marple reflected that the most significant truths often lay not in what people revealed about themselves, but in the careful gaps between revelation and reality. The dinner that had never properly ended was continuing to yield its secrets, though she suspected the most dangerous ones remained hidden beneath the surface of village propriety and social convention. As the church clock struck noon, she found herself looking forward to the afternoon's developments with the sort of patient anticipation that had served her well through decades of observing the endless complexity of human motivation. The afternoon brought Inspector Craddock back to the village hall with renewed purpose, and Miss Marple found herself drawn to observe the methodical transformation of the previous evening's crime scene into a proper investigation. The long tables remained arranged as they had been during dinner, but now bore the clinical attention of official scrutiny rather than social celebration. Constable Pock had carefully catalogued each piece of evidence, and the mysterious second wine glass sat isolated in its labeled container, waiting to reveal its secrets. Young Alf Briggs stood before the inspector with the nervous energy of someone eager to be helpful but uncertain whether his information would prove significant. His account of the wine service proved more revealing than anyone had initially suspected, particularly when he described the specific instructions he had received during the evening's festivities. "I was told as how Mrs. Cavendish wanted the wedding claret, the one with the gold seal," Alf explained, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed his story multiple times. "Came from the passage by the kitchen, it did. I didn't rightly see who spoke, sir, but it were a lady's voice. She said, 'Be a dear and fetch it, Alf,' just like Mrs. Cavendish always does when she's sending you for things." Inspector Craddock's pencil moved steadily across his notebook as he pressed for additional details. What emerged was a picture of careful deception. Someone who had deliberately invoked Mrs. Cavendish's authority to obtain access to the specific bottle that Rupert Ashworth had requested for his sentimental toast. "There was a scent too, if you don't mind me saying," Alf continued, his cheeks flushing slightly at the admission. "Not like cooking smells. Flowery, sort of powdery, like those little violet sweets they keep in the glass jar at the grocer's." Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near the sideboard under the pretense of checking whether her rumbaba required attention, filed this detail away with particular interest. Mrs. Cavendish favored lavender water, while Lydia Ashworth had worn no discernible perfume the previous evening. The violet scent suggested someone else entirely, someone who had deliberately misrepresented their identity to gain access to the wine that would prove so fatally significant. The physical evidence continued to accumulate with disturbing precision. Beneath the head table, Constable Polk discovered a small paper twist of the type used by chemists for dispensing powders, crushed flat and bearing traces of what would undoubtedly prove to be cyanide residue. The bottle that Alf had delivered showed clear signs of having been opened and recorked hastily, without proper implements, suggesting someone working under considerable time pressure. It was during this examination that Inspector Craddock received information that cast Tom Penbury's situation in an even more damaging light. A thorough search of the schoolmaster's lodgings had revealed an extensive collection of chemistry textbooks, perfectly legitimate for his teaching duties but containing detailed information about various poisonous compounds. More significantly, inquiries at the local chemist confirmed that Penbury had recently purchased potassium cyanide, claiming it was needed for photographic developing in connection with the school's camera club. "The evidence appears quite conclusive," Craddock admitted to Miss Marple when she inquired about the investigation's progress. "Young Penbury possessed both motive and means. His presence near the victim has been established, and his behavior suggests considerable guilt. Yet something about the timing troubles me. The precision required for this particular crime seems inconsistent with an act of passionate desperation." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her attention momentarily caught by the sight of Lydia Ashworth emerging from the manor house carrying what appeared to be urgent correspondence. The young widow's remarkable composure continued to strike her as noteworthy, particularly when contrasted with Tom Penbury's obvious emotional turmoil. The afternoon's developments had indeed painted a compelling picture of guilt around the young schoolmaster, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the calculated nature of the crime. Cyanide poisoning required careful planning, precise timing, and considerable knowledge of chemical properties. While Tom Penbury certainly possessed the technical expertise, the psychological profile seemed inconsistent with someone driven by overwhelming emotion to commit murder in such a public setting. More puzzling still was the wine service deception, which suggested someone comfortable with manipulating social conventions and village hierarchies to achieve their purpose. The mysterious violet perfume indicated careful preparation and disguise, elements that seemed to exceed the simple desperation of unrequited love. As the church clock struck 4, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood how to direct suspicion toward convenient targets while remaining safely beyond the reach of official investigation. The dinner that had never properly ended was continuing to yield its secrets, though she suspected the most significant truths remained carefully concealed beneath the surface of obvious conclusions and village speculation. The evidence against Tom Penbury was certainly compelling, but Miss Marple's considerable experience with human nature suggested that the real murderer was someone far more calculating than a heartbroken schoolmaster driven to desperate action. The late afternoon brought a shift in the village atmosphere as Inspector Craddock's methodical investigation began to reveal layers of complexity beneath the apparent simplicity of Tom Penbury's guilt. Miss Marple found herself drawn to pay a condolence call at the manor house, where Lydia Ashworth received visitors in the small morning room rather than the grand drawing room, a choice that spoke volumes about her desire to control both setting and conversation. Lydia poured tea with hands that remained remarkably steady, her composure as carefully maintained as the previous evening. Miss Marple noted that the young widow had removed her wedding ring, leaving a pale band of skin that seemed almost deliberate in its visibility. The morning room carried only the scents of beeswax and faint wood smoke, with no trace of the violet perfume that had become such a significant element in the investigation. "The inspector has been thorough in his questions," Lydia remarked, her voice carrying that same measured control Miss Marple had observed throughout the crisis. "Though I confess I find it difficult to understand why anyone would suspect poor Tom of such a terrible act. His devotion to education and his gentle nature seem entirely inconsistent with violence of any kind." Miss Marple accepted this deflection with appropriate murmurs, while noting how skillfully Lydia directed attention toward Tom Penbury's character, rather than addressing the more concrete aspects of the investigation. When the conversation turned to the sentimental wine that had played such a crucial role in the evening's tragedy, Lydia's response proved particularly revealing. "Rupert was always fond of grand gestures that appeared romantic to observers," she explained with a slight tightening around her eyes. "The wedding claret held significance primarily because it impressed his business associates. I'm afraid sentiment was less important to him than the appearance of sentiment." This glimpse into the Ashworth marriage dynamics provided Miss Marple with valuable insight into the couple's relationship, suggesting that beneath the surface of conjugal devotion lay currents of disappointment and perhaps resentment. The revelation that Rupert's romantic gestures were calculated for public effect rather than private affection painted their marriage in considerably different colors than the village had assumed. During her walk home, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Cavendish near the village green, and their conversation proved illuminating in unexpected ways. The dinner party hostess seemed unusually eager to discuss Rupert Ashworth's plans for modernizing village traditions, describing them with the sort of detailed disapproval that suggested she had given the matter considerable thought. "He had such ambitious ideas for change," Mrs. Cavendish confided, her voice carrying undertones of genuine concern. "The village hall renovations, new management for the annual fete, even suggestions about reorganizing the church flower arrangements. One could see how his energy might create friction with those who valued our established ways." Miss Marple filed this information away with particular interest, recognizing that in villages like St. Mary Mead, threats to established social order could generate surprisingly intense opposition. Mrs. Cavendish's careful emphasis on Ashworth's disruptive potential suggested that his death might have solved problems for more people than just a lovesick schoolmaster. Inspector Craddock's afternoon report provided additional pieces to the increasingly complex puzzle. The chemist's records revealed that someone had inquired about almond oil on the day of the dinner, asking specifically about the kind used for cordials. The customer had been described as a well-dressed woman wearing a distinctive violet perfume, though her heavy veil had obscured her features sufficiently to prevent definitive identification. Most significantly, a visit to the village hall kitchen had revealed a small but telling detail that previous searches had overlooked. Among the refuse beneath the preparation tables, Constable Polk had discovered a crumpled violet sweet wrapper, the sort of confection that elderly ladies often carried for medicinal purposes. The wrapper's presence suggested that someone had been consuming violet sweets while working in the kitchen area, possibly to mask the scent of bitter almonds that would have accompanied the poison preparation. The pattern emerging from these discoveries painted a picture of careful planning and deliberate misdirection. Someone had conducted reconnaissance at the chemist's shop, asking innocent questions that would provide crucial information without arousing suspicion. The same person had moved freely through the kitchen and service areas during the dinner party, confident enough in their authority to direct young Alf Briggs while maintaining their disguise through voice modulation and distinctive perfume. Mrs. Price at the post office provided the final detail that would prove so significant to Miss Marple's understanding of the case. The registered packet from the London wine merchant had indeed arrived 3 days before the dinner, and Rupert Ashworth himself had inquired about its safe delivery. More intriguingly, Mrs. Price recalled detecting a sweet floral scent when she handled the paperwork, though she had attributed it to her imagination at the time. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the accumulating evidence with the sort of patient attention that had served her well through decades of observing human nature. The case against Tom Penbury remained compelling on its surface, yet the underlying pattern suggested someone far more calculating than a young man driven by desperate emotion. The violet perfume, the careful voice disguise, the systematic preparation, and the intimate knowledge of village social dynamics all pointed toward a perpetrator who understood exactly how to manipulate both evidence and suspicion to achieve their purpose. The dinner that had never properly ended was continuing to yield its secrets, though Miss Marple suspected that the most dangerous truths remained carefully concealed beneath the surface of village respectability and social convention. The evening's contemplations had settled into Miss Marple's consciousness like sediment in still water, and when morning arrived with its customary chorus of birdsong and distant church bells, she found herself drawn to her garden with unusual purpose. The late roses required attention, but more significantly, her position among the flower beds provided an excellent vantage point for observing the comings and goings that revealed so much about village life in times of crisis. It was while deadheading the last of the chrysanthemums that she observed Miss Phoebe Barton emerging from the post office with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements. Miss Barton served as treasurer to virtually every village organization that required financial oversight, from the Harvest Festival Committee to the Church Restoration Fund. She was the sort of quietly indispensable person who managed practical affairs, while others concerned themselves with more visible forms of leadership, and her small, neat figure was as familiar a sight in St. Mary Mead as the weathercock on the church tower. What struck Miss Marple as noteworthy this particular morning was the distinctive scent that lingered in Miss Barton's wake as she passed the garden gate. The sweet, powdery fragrance of violet pastilles carried clearly on the still air, evoking immediate memories of the previous evening's investigation and young Alf Briggs' description of the mysterious woman who had sent him for the fatal wine bottle. The morning's second significant observation came during her visit to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was arranging the weekly flower rota with a sort of methodical precision that made village life function smoothly. Their conversation naturally turned to the previous evening's tragedy, and Mrs. Clement's reminiscences proved more illuminating than either woman initially realized. Poor Miss Barton has been quite distressed by the whole affair, Mrs. Clement confided as she consulted her carefully maintained schedules. She takes her responsibilities so seriously, you know, and the thought that something went wrong during an event she helped organize has been weighing heavily on her mind. She was here earlier, asking whether I thought the committee might be held liable for what happened. Miss Marple accepted this information with appropriate murmurs of sympathy, while noting the underlying anxiety it revealed. In her considerable experience, genuine shock typically produced different concerns than immediate worry about legal liability. Miss Barton's focus on potential consequences suggested someone who had been calculating risks and outcomes rather than simply processing unexpected grief. The conversation took a more revealing turn when Mrs. Clement mentioned Miss Barton's remarkable talent for vocal mimicry, a skill that had made her invaluable during the annual charity entertainments. "She can sound exactly like anyone she chooses," Mrs. Clement explained with obvious admiration. "Last year's variety show, she did Mrs. Cavendish so perfectly that even the Colonel was fooled. That particular way of saying, "be a dear," that Mrs. Cavendish has, Miss Barton captured it exactly. This revelation connected several previously puzzling elements with startling clarity. Young Alf Briggs had been convinced that Mrs. Cavendish herself had sent him for the special wine, yet Mrs. Cavendish had denied any such instruction. Miss Barton's ability to mimic voices provided a perfect explanation for the deception, while her role as committee treasurer gave her both access to the kitchen areas and unquestioned authority to direct the evening's practical arrangements. Inspector Craddock's afternoon visit confirmed that the investigation had indeed begun to shift its focus, though he approached the subject with characteristic caution. The physical evidence continued to accumulate in ways that supported Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the true perpetrator's identity. The laboratory analysis of the mysterious second wine glass had revealed traces of almond syrup, sufficient to mask the bitter scent of cyanide when mixed hastily with strong wine. More significantly, the glass bore faint traces of a distinctive mauve lipstick that matched neither Lydia Ashworth's bare lips nor Mrs. Cavendish's preferred coral shade. "We've also discovered correspondence that sheds new light on Ashworth's recent activities," Craddock explained, consulting his notebook with the sort of careful attention that suggested significant developments. It appears he had been planning what he called modernizing improvements to various village institutions. Most significantly, he intended to announce at the dinner that all committee finances would be subject to professional audit and modern accounting procedures. The implications of this revelation rippled through Miss Marple's understanding like stones thrown into still water. For someone like Miss Barton, whose authority and social position depended entirely on her reputation for financial competence, the threat of professional scrutiny could represent complete social ruin. If irregularities existed in the various accounts she managed, Ashworth's proposed reforms would inevitably expose them to public examination. The afternoon brought additional confirmation of Miss Barton's central role in the evening's events. A visit to her cottage, ostensibly to discuss the church flower arrangements, revealed details that supported the emerging pattern of evidence. The small, immaculately maintained parlor carried the distinctive scent of violet pastilles, and Miss Marple noted the presence of several items that connected directly to the investigation. A grey veil hung on the hall stand, its edge bearing a small tear that suggested hasty use, while a lipstick in the precise shade of Parma twilight sat beside the tea service. Most tellingly, Miss Barton's careful responses to innocent questions revealed the sort of detailed knowledge about the evening's wine service that exceeded what an uninvolved committee member should reasonably possess. Her explanations came readily, but carried the rehearsed quality of someone who had anticipated such inquiries and prepared appropriate answers. As the day progressed toward evening, Miss Marple reflected on how the investigation had evolved from its initial focus on obvious emotional motives to reveal something far more calculating and methodical. The dinner that had never properly ended was continuing to yield its secrets, though the most dangerous truths remained carefully concealed beneath the surface of village respectability and social convention. Miss Barton's position as financial overseer had provided both motive and opportunity, while her skills in vocal mimicry and her intimate knowledge of village social dynamics had enabled the careful deception that had initially directed suspicion toward the unfortunate Tom Penbury. The evening's final development came with news that Tom Penbury had failed to appear for his scheduled interview with Inspector Craddock and had apparently left the village on his bicycle without informing anyone of his destination. While this disappearance would undoubtedly fuel further speculation about his guilt, Miss Marple suspected it represented the desperate flight of an innocent man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control rather than the calculated escape of a murderer. The true perpetrator, she reflected, was far more likely to remain close at hand, maintaining the appearance of helpful cooperation while carefully monitoring the investigation's progress toward what she hoped would be its inevitable conclusion. The news of Tom Penbury's disappearance rippled through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar mixture of shock and satisfaction that accompanies the confirmation of village suspicions. By dawn, Mrs. Price at the post office had compiled a comprehensive account of his flight, complete with sightings of his bicycle near the railway halt and speculation about his destination. The general consensus held that his departure constituted a clear admission of guilt, though Miss Marple found herself troubled by the convenient timing and dramatic nature of his escape. Inspector Craddock's morning briefing revealed additional developments that complicated the apparently straightforward narrative of Tom's guilt. A thorough search of the village hall had uncovered a small fire in the record storage room, discovered in the early hours by the night constable during his rounds. The blaze had been quickly contained, but not before consuming several account ledgers and committee documents. Most significantly, the fire had originated in the area where Miss Barton kept the financial records for her various treasurer positions, though enough survived to reveal disturbing discrepancies in the manor fund accounts. "The timing strikes me as remarkably convenient," Craddock observed as he examined the charred remains of the ledgers. "A confession letter has also appeared, pushed under the post office door sometime during the night. It bears Tom Penbury's initial and expresses remorse for a terrible mistake with the wine, though the handwriting seems unusually careful for someone in desperate flight." Miss Marple studied the letter with the sort of careful attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. The paper bore the distinctive texture of committee stationery, and along its margin she detected traces of violet powder where nervous fingers had pressed. The phrasing struck her as oddly formal for Tom Penbury's usually direct manner of expression, while the large looped initial suggested someone more accustomed to signing official documents than marking school papers. The morning's discoveries painted an increasingly complex picture of calculated deception. Hidden behind cleaning supplies in the maintenance cupboard, Constable Polk had found a grey veil bearing traces of violet perfume, along with a small glass vial that showed clear evidence of having contained both almond extract and something far more sinister. Most tellingly, a leather portfolio contained financial documents that revealed systematic manipulation of village accounts spanning several years, with funds diverted through increasingly sophisticated methods of bookkeeping sleight of hand. Armed with this evidence and her growing understanding of the case's true dynamics, Miss Marple decided that a neighborly visit to Miss Barton was in order. She approached the neat cottage with its perfectly maintained garden, carrying a basket of late apples and wearing the sort of gentle expression that had served her well through decades of extracting truth from reluctant sources. Miss Barton received her with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements, though Miss Marple noted subtle signs of strain beneath the carefully maintained composure. The cottage's interior reflected its owner's meticulous nature, every surface polished to perfection, every ornament precisely positioned. The familiar scent of violet pastilles hung in the air, now carrying associations far more sinister than mere confectionery preference. "Such a distressing business about poor Tom," Miss Marple began, accepting tea served in delicate china that spoke of careful domestic pride. "Though I must confess, his sudden departure strikes me as rather unlike his usual thoughtful nature. In my experience, truly guilty people often remain close at hand, the better to monitor how their deceptions are received." Miss Barton's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around her teacup, though her voice remained steady. "I suppose the pressure of suspicion became unbearable. One can hardly blame him for seeking escape, given the evidence against him." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, allowing her gaze to drift across the room's careful arrangements. "Evidence can be so misleading, can't it? Take that particular wine service, for instance. Young Alf Briggs was so certain that Mrs. Cavendish had sent him for the special claret, yet she denies any such instruction. It makes one wonder who might possess the skill to mimic her voice so convincingly, particularly that distinctive way she has of saying "be a dare" when requesting assistance. The observation struck home with visible impact. Miss Barton's carefully controlled expression flickered, revealing a moment of genuine alarm before reasserting itself. Miss Marple continued with gentle relentlessness, describing the violet scent that had accompanied the mysterious wine request, the financial irregularities that Ashworth's proposed audit would have exposed, and the remarkable precision with which suspicion had been directed toward the most emotionally vulnerable suspect. "The truly clever criminal," Miss Marple observed with deceptive mildness, "understands that the best hiding place is often in plain sight. Someone trusted with community finances, skilled in vocal mimicry from years of charity entertainments, familiar with every aspect of village social dynamics. Such a person could orchestrate both murder and misdirection with remarkable efficiency." Miss Barton's composure finally began to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence and gentle psychological pressure. Her face flushed, her hands trembled, and her eyes darted toward the window as if calculating distances to potential escape routes. The transformation from competent village treasurer to cornered suspect was swift and unmistakable, confirming what Miss Marple's careful observations had already suggested. "Mr. Ashworth's audit would have destroyed everything," Miss Barton whispered, her voice losing its characteristic brisk authority. 20 years of careful management, of making inadequate funds stretch to cover necessary expenses. He would have ruined it all with his modern procedures and professional oversight. The confession that followed revealed the twisted logic of someone who had convinced herself that embezzlement constituted community service and murder represented necessary protection of village institutions. Miss Barton's careful bookkeeping had concealed systematic theft justified as fiscal creativity, while her murder of Rupert Ashworth had been calculated to preserve both her reputation and her continued access to the funds she had been systematically diverting. As Inspector Craddock arrived to make the formal arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous combination of opportunity, desperation, and self-justification that had transformed a respected community servant into a calculating killer. The dinner that had never properly ended had finally yielded its most carefully guarded secret, though the revelation brought little satisfaction to those who had valued Miss Barton's apparent dedication to village welfare. The truth, as Miss Marple had often observed, rarely provided the comfortable resolution that people preferred, particularly when it revealed that the most trusted members of society could harbor the darkest deceptions of all. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead with the peculiar quiet that follows the resolution of long-held mysteries. Though Miss Marple suspected it would be some time before the village fully recovered from the shock of discovering that their most reliable treasurer had been both thief and murderer, hiding behind a facade of civic virtue that had fooled everyone except those who understood that human nature, in all its infinite complexity, remained as predictable as the changing seasons. The arrest of Miss Phoebe Barton sent tremors through the carefully ordered world of St. Mary Mead that extended far beyond the immediate shock of discovering a murderer among their most trusted citizens. As Inspector Craddock led her away in handcuffs, her small, neat figure seeming to diminish with each step, Miss Marple observed from her garden gate how the village's comfortable assumptions about respectability and civic virtue had been fundamentally shaken. The woman who had managed their finances with such apparent dedication had systematically betrayed every organization she had served, transforming trusted stewardship into elaborate theft. The morning brought Tom Penbury's return, his bicycle weaving unsteadily down the main street as exhaustion and relief battled for dominance in his bearing. His disappearance, it emerged, had been motivated not by guilt, but by the overwhelming despair of an innocent man watching evidence accumulate against him through no fault of his own. He had spent a sleepless night in a railway station waiting room, wrestling with the impossible choice between flight and facing charges he knew he could not adequately defend against. Inspector Craddock's debriefing session revealed the full scope of Miss Barton's deceptions with methodical precision. The financial irregularities extended back nearly a decade, beginning with small adjustments to cover temporary shortfalls and evolving into systematic embezzlement disguised as creative accounting. The Manor Fund had been particularly targeted, with thousands of pounds diverted through fictitious maintenance expenses and inflated supplier invoices, creating exactly the crisis that Rupert Ashworth had feared when he proposed his modernizing audit. Miss Marple found herself called upon to explain her deductive process to the assembled investigators, and she did so with the gentle precision that had served her well through decades of observing human nature. "It began with a voice," she explained, settling into her chair with characteristic deliberation. Young Alf Briggs was adamant that Mrs. Cavendish had sent him for the special wine, yet Mrs. Cavendish denied any such instruction. When Mrs. Clement mentioned Miss Barton's remarkable talent for vocal mimicry, particularly her perfect imitation of Mrs. Cavendish's distinctive phrases, the deception became clear. She continued weaving together the threads of evidence with practiced skill. The violet scent that Alf described, the wrapper found in the kitchen, the customer at the chemist inquiring about almond oil while wearing distinctive perfume, all pointed to Miss Barton. She used those pastilles not merely as a preference, but as a deliberate means of masking the bitter almond scent of cyanide, while creating a memorable but misleading trail for witnesses to follow. The technical details of the poisoning emerged through careful reconstruction. Miss Barton's position as committee treasurer had provided unrestricted access to kitchen and service areas, while her reputation for efficient organization meant her presence anywhere during preparations aroused no suspicion. The second wine glass had allowed her to prepare the poisoned drink away from the table, using almond extract to mask the cyanide's distinctive odor before swapping it for Ashworth's original glass during the confusion surrounding Lydia's supposed faintness. "The displaced place card was deliberate misdirection," Miss Marple observed, "designed to implicate young Tom, whose obvious devotion to Mrs. Ashworth made him a convenient scapegoat. Miss Barton understood village psychology well enough to know that emotional motives would seem more compelling than financial ones to most observers. Yet, as the afternoon progressed and the immediate satisfaction of solved mystery began to settle, Miss Marple found herself troubled by certain aspects of the case that remained incompletely explained. The precision of the wine service deception suggested familiarity with the manor house's domestic arrangements that exceeded what a village treasurer should reasonably possess. More puzzling was the question of how Miss Barton had known about Ashworth's specific request for the sentimental wedding claret, information that had been shared only with Mrs. Cavendish and presumably with his wife. Inspector Craddock, reviewing his notes with the thoroughness of someone who distrusted cases that concluded too neatly, shared her unease. "The confession explains the method and the immediate motive," he admitted, "but certain details suggest a level of inside knowledge that troubles me. Miss Barton's access to information about the Ashworth household arrangement seems more extensive than her position would warrant." The village's response to these revelations followed predictable patterns, with shock giving way to speculation and speculation evolving into the sort of comprehensive gossip that would reshape community memory for years to come. Mrs. Cavendish emerged from her cottage wearing the stunned expression of someone whose carefully ordered world had been fundamentally disrupted, while the various committee members began the painful process of assessing the full extent of their financial losses. As evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the case's resolution with the sort of quiet satisfaction that accompanied successful detection, tempered by the nagging sense that human nature, in all its complexity, rarely revealed itself completely in a single dramatic confession. The dinner that had never properly ended had yielded its primary secret, yet she found herself wondering whether all the evening's mysteries had truly been solved, or whether some deeper truths remained carefully concealed beneath the surface of village respectability. The comfortable assumptions that had governed St. Mary Mead's social order had been shaken but not entirely destroyed, and Miss Marple suspected that the full implications of the evening's revelations would continue to unfold in ways that might yet surprise those who believed the case was closed. In her considerable experience with human motivation, the most dangerous secrets were often those that remained hidden, even after justice had apparently been served, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves with consequences that could prove even more devastating than the original crime. The days following Miss Barton's arrest brought a peculiar mixture of relief and unease to St. Mary Mead, as if the village had awakened from a nightmare only to discover that some of the shadows remained stubbornly in place. Miss Marple found herself drawn repeatedly to her garden, where the familiar rhythms of deadheading roses and tidying borders provided comfort while her mind continued to work through the final details of a case that had proven more complex than anyone had initially suspected. Inspector Craddock's return on the third morning brought news that validated her persistent sense that important questions remained unanswered. Miss Barton's confession, while comprehensive regarding the technical aspects of the poisoning, had begun to reveal additional layers of deception during her continued questioning. The prisoner's initial reluctance to discuss certain details had given way to a more complete account that painted an even more calculating picture of premeditated murder. She's admitted to considerably more extensive preparation than we initially understood, Craddock explained as they walked through Miss Marple's garden. The reconnaissance at the chemist's shop, the practice sessions with voice mimicry, even test runs of the wine service deception during previous committee meetings. What struck me most forcefully was her detailed knowledge of the Ashworth household routines, which she claims to have gathered through systematic observation over several months. Miss Marple paused beside her chrysanthemums, her attention caught by this revelation. Systematic observation suggests a level of planning that extends well beyond financial desperation, she observed thoughtfully. In my experience, such elaborate preparation usually indicates multiple motivations working in concert, rather than a single driving force. The inspector's notebook revealed the full scope of Miss Barton's calculated campaign against Rupert Ashworth. Her embezzlement had indeed provided the primary motive, but her confession now revealed a deeper resentment of his modernizing influence on village traditions that she had spent decades helping to maintain. The proposed audit represented not merely financial exposure, but a fundamental challenge to the social order that had given her life meaning and authority. She described him as a disruptive force, Craddock continued, someone whose London ways threatened to destroy what she called proper village values. The financial irregularities were serious enough, but her real fury seemed directed at his casual dismissal of traditions she considered sacred. The murder was as much about preserving her vision of village life as protecting her reputation. This psychological insight provided the missing piece that had troubled Miss Marple throughout the investigation. The precision of the crime had suggested someone driven by more than simple self-preservation, and Miss Barton's confession now revealed the complex mixture of personal, financial, and ideological motivations that had enabled her to plan and execute murder with such calculated efficiency. The afternoon brought Tom Penbury to Miss Marple's cottage, his relief at vindication tempered by the trauma of having been so thoroughly deceived by someone he had trusted and respected. His account of Miss Barton's behavior in the weeks preceding the dinner party provided additional confirmation of her systematic preparation, including subtle questions about the Ashworth household and seemingly innocent inquiries about village social protocols. She asked me about Mrs. Ashworth's adjustment to village life, Tom explained, his voice still carrying traces of bewilderment. Wanted to know whether she seemed happy in her marriage, whether Mr. Ashworth treated her with proper consideration. At the time, I thought it was ordinary concern for a newcomer's welfare, but now I realize she was gathering intelligence for her campaign against him. Miss Marple reflected that Miss Barton's questions had served multiple purposes, both assessing potential allies and identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The systematic nature of her information gathering revealed a criminal mind of considerable sophistication, someone who understood that successful deception required thorough preparation and careful attention to human psychology. The village's response to these additional revelations followed predictable patterns. with shock giving way to a more nuanced understanding of how thoroughly they had been manipulated. Mrs. Cavendish emerged from her initial horror with renewed determination to restore proper oversight to village finances, while the various committee members began the painful process of rebuilding trust and establishing new procedures to prevent future deception. As the week progressed toward its conclusion, Miss Marple found herself called upon to explain her investigative process to a gathering of village worthies who sought to understand how such elaborate deception had been possible in their close-knit community. She did so with characteristic gentleness, emphasizing that Miss Barton's crime had succeeded precisely because it exploited the trust and social conventions that made village life possible. "The most dangerous criminals," she observed, settling into her chair with the deliberate care of age, "are often those who understand how to use our better instincts against us." Miss Barton's reputation for civic virtue provided perfect camouflage for systematic theft, while her apparent dedication to village traditions concealed a willingness to commit murder to preserve her position. The physical evidence had told its own story to those who knew how to read such signs. The violet perfume, the voice mimicry, the systematic preparation, and the intimate knowledge of village social dynamics had all pointed toward someone with both opportunity and the psychological sophistication to orchestrate complex deception. Miss Barton's confession had merely confirmed what careful observation had already suggested about the calculated nature of her crime. As autumn settled more deeply over St. Mary Mead and the immediate shock of murder began to fade into village memory, Miss Marple reflected on the case's broader implications for understanding human nature. The dinner that had never properly ended had revealed not merely one woman's capacity for evil, but the dangerous combination of intelligence, resentment, and moral flexibility that could transform a respected community servant into a calculating killer. Inspector Craddock's final report noted that the Crown's case would proceed without difficulty, supported by comprehensive physical evidence and a detailed confession that left no significant questions unanswered. Miss Barton's systematic theft had been thoroughly documented, her murder method completely understood, and her psychological motivations clearly established through her own admissions. The village settled into new rhythms, forever changed by the revelation that respectability could conceal such elaborate deception. The various committees established new oversight procedures, financial records were subjected to professional audit, and social gatherings acquired a subtle wariness that would persist long after the immediate trauma had faded. Yet life continued with the resilience that had always characterized St. Mary Mead, adapting to new realities while preserving the essential community bonds that made village existence both possible and worthwhile. Miss Marple returned to her knitting and her garden with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had helped restore justice to a disrupted world. The case had demonstrated once again that human nature, for all its infinite complexity, remained as readable as the changing seasons to those who possessed the patience to observe its patterns. The dinner party that had ended in murder had finally concluded with truth, though the lessons it taught about the dangerous depths of human motivation would continue to resonate through village memory for years to come. In her sitting room that evening, with the familiar comfort of her needles clicking and the gentle tick of the mantel clock marking time's steady passage, Miss Marple reflected that the most valuable lesson of the entire affair might be the reminder that evil often wore the most respectable faces, and that the greatest vigilance was required not against obvious threats, but against those who used virtue itself as a disguise for vice. The village would remember, and perhaps be wiser for the remembering, though she suspected that human nature would continue to provide new variations on ancient themes of greed, resentment, and the terrible lengths to which ordinary people would go to preserve their carefully constructed worlds. The weeks that followed Miss Barton's conviction brought to St. Mary Mead the peculiar mixture of relief and melancholy that accompanies the resolution of great mysteries. Inspector Craddock's final report documented the full scope of the crimes with methodical precision. £8,000 embezzled across 9 years, 7 different village accounts systematically plundered, and a murder planned with the sort of calculated efficiency that had initially made it seem like the desperate act of a heartbroken schoolmaster rather than the culmination of a decade-long campaign of financial deception. Miss Marple observed from her sitting-room window as the village began its slow process of healing, noting how the familiar rhythms of daily life had acquired subtle new patterns. The post office buzzed with renewed energy as Mrs. Price coordinated the establishment of new oversight committees, while Mrs. Cavendish emerged from her cottage each morning with the determined expression of someone rebuilding both reputation and social order from carefully laid foundations. The Harvest Festival Committee would meet again, though with professional auditors present and financial procedures that would have impressed a London bank. Tom Penbury's vindication had come with a sort of quiet dignity that spoke well of his character, though Miss Marple noted how the experience had transformed him from an earnest young schoolmaster into someone who understood the dangerous complexities that could lurk beneath village respectability. His obvious relief at being cleared was tempered by a new wariness, the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned that innocence provided no protection against the machinations of a truly calculating mind. The trial itself had proceeded with the efficient dispatch of English justice, Miss Barton's guilty plea eliminating the need for dramatic courtroom revelations while ensuring that the full scope of her crimes became part of the public record. The psychological assessment prepared for sentencing had revealed the complex mixture of motivations that had driven her to such desperate measures. Embezzlement that had begun as temporary borrowing during financial crisis evolved into systematic theft justified as superior financial management and culminated in murder disguised as the protection of village traditions. Lydia Ashworth's departure from the manor house had been conducted with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her behavior throughout the crisis. She sold the property through London agents, packed her belongings with methodical care, and announced her intention to begin a new life abroad where the shadows of her brief, tragic marriage could not follow. Miss Marple, observing Lydia's almost serene detachment from the scene of so much drama, reflected that some people possessed the remarkable ability to shed their past like an unwanted garment, moving forward unencumbered by sentiment or regret. As autumn deepened into winter and the immediate shock of murder began to fade into village memory, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the broader lessons that the case had taught about the nature of evil and the dangerous depths of human motivation. Miss Barton's crime had succeeded precisely because it exploited the trust and social conventions that made community life possible, transforming virtue itself into a weapon against the innocent. The treasurer's reputation for meticulous attention to detail had provided perfect camouflage for financial manipulation, while her apparent dedication to village traditions had concealed a willingness to commit murder to preserve her position. The physical evidence had told its story with mathematical precision to those who knew how to read such signs. The violet perfume, the voice mimicry, the systematic preparation, and the intimate knowledge of village social dynamics had all pointed towards someone with both opportunity and the psychological sophistication to orchestrate complex deception. Yet the most significant clue had been Miss Barton's own behavior, her careful composure in the face of crisis, and her systematic efforts to direct suspicion toward the most vulnerable suspect. In her sitting room that final evening, with the familiar comfort of her knitting needles clicking and the gentle tick of the mantel clock marking time's steady passage, Miss Marple reflected on how the dinner that had never properly ended had finally reached its true conclusion. Not in the dramatic revelation of guilt, but in the quiet restoration of justice, in the painful rebuilding of community trust. The evening's carefully orchestrated celebration had become something far more complex than anyone had intended, revealing not merely one woman's capacity for evil, but the dangerous combination of intelligence, resentment, and moral flexibility that could transform a respected community servant into a calculating killer. The village would remember, and perhaps be wiser for the remembering, though she suspected that human nature would continue to provide new variations on ancient themes of greed, resentment, and the terrible lengths to which ordinary people would go to preserve their carefully constructed worlds. The lesson of Miss Barton's crime was not that evil was impossible to detect, but that it required constant vigilance and the sort of careful attention to human behavior that most people preferred to avoid. The most dangerous predators, she had learned long ago, were often those who wore the masks of respectability most convincingly, using society's own virtues as camouflage for systematic vice. As winter settled over St. Mary Mead with its familiar patterns of shortened days and longer evenings, Miss Marple returned to the comfortable routines that had sustained her through decades of village life. The mystery was solved, justice was served, and life continued with the resilience that had always characterized the human spirit in its endless struggle between darkness and light. The dinner party that ended in murder had finally concluded, leaving behind lessons about human nature that would outlast the memory of the crime itself. And in that quiet triumph of truth over deception, she found both satisfaction and confirmation that patient observation would always, eventually, prevail.